Hello and welcome, my fellow Night Owl history nerds. Before we dive into the foggy highlands and crumbling stone castles of medieval Scotland, where even the sheep probably side-eyed strangers, I've got a tiny request. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you sipping tea in Manchester, grumbling about the rain at bedtime, kicking off your day in Melbourne, also grumbling about the weather, or somewhere else entirely, likely still grumbling about the weather? I'm thrilled you're here no matter where you are. If you love these quirky trips back to times when a stubbed toe could literally send you to the afterlife, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. Now get comfy, way comfier than any medieval Scot ever dreamed of settle in, and let's teleport to a land of jaw-dropping beauty and jaw-dropping brutality. A place where bagpipes wailed across the glens, sounding less like music and more like a cat brawl during a thunderstorm. And the clash of swords echoed through the craggy highlands, usually followed by someone muttering, "Well, that's gonna leave a scar." The Scotland we know today, full of friendly folks who'll give you directions, even if they're totally lost. Cozy pubs where the beer's warm and the vibes are warmer, and landscapes so magical you forget you're soaked from the eternal drizzle hides a past so grim it makes reality TV look like a yoga retreat. Hollywood loves to sell us a dreamy Middle Ages with gallant knights and merry men, all sporting suspiciously perfect teeth, despite the total lack of dental hygiene, and somehow staying spotless in what was basically a giant medieval dumpster. But for the Scots, it was clan warfare so intense that family reunions looked like tea parties, English invasions as welcome as a vegan, at a Highland hog roast at church so heavy-handed, your local tax guy would seem like Santa Claus, and famine and plague crashing the party like the worst kind of freeloaders. Life was short, harsh, and often just plain savage for most folks. And when I say short, I mean hitting 30 was such a flex they'd have thrown a rager if they weren't too busy starving. Whether you were a peasant toiling in the fields making today's minimum wage workers look like billionaires, or caught up in the power plays of clan chiefs and kings who treated lives like disposable napkins, we're about to uncover the raw truth. As you drift off on your cozy mattress in your toasty room, luxuries that would have blown a medieval Scot's mind, we'll strip away the fairy tales and see what it was really like to live, love, and usually die way too young in this chaotic era. We'll meet fierce warriors who called it a win if they kept all their limbs by sunset, and pious queens trying to civilize a land where indoor plumbing was as sci-fi as a spaceship. We'll tag along with regular folks scraping by in conditions that'd make a modern camping trip feel like a luxury spa, and watch the roots of Scotland's rebellious spirit sprout amid the chaos, because nothing screams rebellious like refusing to go down without a fight when life's throwing every punch in the book at you. But first, let's set the stage, and oh boy, what a stage it was. Picture a wild, untamed landscape where mist hugs the locks like a clingy ex who can't take a hint, and the wind whispers through the heather with gossip juicier than a tabloid headline. The highlands loom like grumpy old bouncers who've been on the job too long to care, their peaks lost in clouds that seem to have a personal vendetta against the sun, and their valleys carved by icy streams that sound poetic but would freeze your toes off faster than you can say hypothermia. Down in the lowlands, rolling hills lead to so-called fertile farmlands, though fertile here means you might get half a harvest if the weather, your raiding neighbors, and a random locust swarm don't team up to ruin your day. Villages huddle around simple stone kirks where the priest would preach weekly that all your misery was probably your fault because apparently even the Almighty loved a good guilt trip. The air was crisp and cool, or let's be real, freezing enough to make your teeth chatter, carrying the scent of wild gorse and peat smoke. Not sure what peat smoke smells like. Imagine burning a mix of grass mud and the shattered dreams of everyone trying to stay warm in medieval Scotland. It's an acquired taste, kind of like sipping a fine wine that's just fermented potato juice. Dense forests of Scots pine and oak were home to red deer and wild boar, which sounds majestic until you realize meeting a wild boar with just a pointy stick and a can-do attitude was less nature adventure and more certain death. Overhead, golden eagles screeched like nature's air raid sirens, probably wondering why these humans were so determined to make their lives a total mess. At night, the sky exploded into a glittery star show unmarred by modern city lights, mostly because streetlights were a few centuries away, and after a day of dodging death, most folks were too exhausted to stargaze anyway. But I bet after a particularly brutal day of survival, glancing up at that cosmic disco might have been a tiny comfort, or at least made their problems feel less like a soap opera and more like a footnote in the universe's drama. Yet in this jaw-dropping landscape that'd make today's Instagram influencers lose their minds if they could survive the first hour, without Wi-Fi danger was everywhere, like a clingy ex who just won't quit. Rival clans planned raids and revenge with the passion of sports fans arguing over a bad call, except with way more bloodshed and zero rules about playing nice. Nobles schemed for power and land with the subtlety of reality TV drama queens, but the prize was a bit bigger than a cash grab. It was more like winner gets to keep breathing. And the threat of English invasion loomed like a storm cloud with a personal grudge against Scottish freedom, bringing all the warmth of a tax collector who's also your high school bully. For the common folk, aka 95% of the population who didn't win the medieval lottery of being born into the fancy clothes and castle club, life was a daily gauntlet of nature's wrath disease and the whims of their overlords. It was like playing a video game on impossible mode, but with no extra lives, no cheat codes, and definitely no tech support to call when your whole village got wiped out. They found rhythm in the seasons, which basically meant a predictable cycle of misery. Spring brought floods and the backbreaking work of planting crops that might not even make it. Summer gave a brief, not freezing break ruined by clan raids. Autumn was a frantic harvest race to maybe not starve. And winter was nature's grand finale of, let's see how much these humans can take before they cry uncle. They clung to family and clan bonds for comfort because when everyone's miserable together, it's kind of like a group hug, except you're all huddling for warmth while rationing a single handful of oats until spring. The church offered some hope, promising a VIP afterlife if you could just survive this dumpster fire of a life, probably a pretty tempting deal when every morning was a gamble between starvation, plague violence, or the deluxe combo of all three. This is the chaotic backdrop of our story, a tale of grit that'd make motivational posters look like they're just been doodling with crayons. Faith tested harder than a medieval bridge in a storm, and a stubborn Scottish spirit that laughed in the face of centuries of hardship so brutal that a tough Monday morning looks like a spa day. We'll meet kings and peasants, saints and scoundrels, heroes, and villains, all starring in the wild drama of Scottish history like actors in a play where the script's missing and the director loves throwing curveballs, like say a sudden plague or two. For now, let the sounds of the past lull you to sleep, the rustling leaves in the forest that might be hiding bandits, or just a very sneaky squirrel, the soft mooing of cattle that were basically someone's entire 401k, and the faint strum of a minstrel's lute singing about heroes who were probably more heroic in song than in real life, where they were likely just good at not dying. Let these be your medieval ASMR as we gear up to dive into the heart of medieval Scotland, where life was an adventure in the truest sense, uncomfortable, dangerous, and with an ending as unpredictable as a reality TV finale. Sleep tight, dear traveler, knowing your worst worry. Tomorrow might be a slow internet connection, not whether rival clans will torch your village while you're dreaming. Tomorrow, we'll dig into this tale for real, and you'll thank your lucky stars for modern miracles like central heating supermarkets and the fact that most days don't involve sword fights. Sweet dreams, and take comfort in knowing that no matter how rough your day was, at least you're not dodging wild boars with a stick in medieval Scotland. Back in those wild days, Scotland was a chaotic patchwork of clans, each one fiercely independent and utterly convinced they were the best thing since sliced bread. except bread wasn't sliced yet, and they'd probably stab you for suggesting otherwise. Think of them as modern football fans, but instead of chanting in the stands, they were out there settling scores with swords, because nothing says team spirit like a good old-fashioned bloodbath. The clan was the glue of Scottish society, giving you an identity protection and a warm fuzzy feeling of belonging in a world where the rule of law was about as sturdy as a sandcastle at high tide. At the top of each clan was the chieftain, a guy who was part warlord, part judge, and part overbearing dad. Imagine a medieval CEO, Supreme Court judge, and army general rolled into one, but with worse job security and a retirement plan that usually involved a violent death. He was a warrior king who'd lead the charge in battle, a judge who'd settle disputes with the finality of a guillotine, and a father figure whose version of tough love would make modern parenting experts faint. The chief was in charge of keeping his clan safe and fed, which was no small feat. When your neighbors were always plotting to steal your cows and your enemies thought diplomacy meant stab first, talk later, loyalty to your clan was everything way more important than any far-off king who, to the average Highlander, might as well have been a unicorn for all the good he did. In a land where royal power was challenged by anyone with enough swords and a bad attitude, clan bonds were the medieval equivalent of duct tape messy, but it got the job done. Your word was your sacred oath, and breaking it, or betraying your clan, was the kind of social blunder that'd get you shunned, banished, or creatively dispatched, depending on how much your clansmen felt. Like playing Guess the Punishment that day. It wasn't just a faux pas, it was the kind of mistake that'd get you permanently banned from family BBQs, assuming you survived long enough to RSVP. But this die-hard clan loyalty had a dark side, fueling endless cycles of violence and revenge that could drag on for generations, like the world's most lethal game of telephone. An insult to a clan's honor, and Highlanders had a very loose definition of insult, ranging from actual theft to, "you looked at me funny," a cattle raid that wiped out someone's life savings, or a land dispute over a patch of dirt. Nobody really wanted could spiral into a blood feud that'd claim more lives than a season finale of a medieval soap opera. These feuds snowballed like a grudge-filled avalanche, starting with something small, like who owned that one cow, and turning into a multi-generational grudge match that made the Hatfields and McCoys look like they were just arguing over who got the last slice of pizza. One of the juiciest feuds was between Clan MacDougall and Clan Cameron, two heavyweight families in the Western Highlands who'd turned hating each other into an Olympic sport. For centuries, they brawled over territory resources and bragging rights, passing down their beef like a cursed family heirloom nobody could return. The MacDougalls, led by Duncan MacDougall, a guy who solved problems with the finesse of a sledgehammer, ruled the lands around Loch Awe. Duncan was a charismatic leader who inspired loyalty through charm, and the very real fear that crossing him meant meeting his prized collection of sharp toys. Known for his battle smarts, his ability to hold a grudge longer than a camel holds water, and his habit of taking any disagreement as a personal attack that demanded an over-the-top response, Duncan was not someone you wanted to mess with. The Camerons, on the other hand, were led by Ewan Cameron, aka the Wolf of Lochiel, a nickname that had nothing to do with his party hosting skills and everything to do with his terrifying reputation. Ewan was the kind of guy whose name moms used to scare naughty kids and other chiefs double-check their locks at night. A master of guerrilla warfare, cattle rustling, and making his enemies' lives so miserable they'd rather become monks than deal with him. Ewan was a one-man chaos machine. Their feud kicked off in the early 13th century when King Alexander II, in a moment of genius that historians politely call a bit of an oopsie, gifted the MacDougalls a huge chunk of land in Argyll as a thank you for their loyalty during a rebellion. The catch. That land had been the Cameron stomping ground for generations, claimed through the sacred Highland tradition of "we got here first, and we've got the swords to back it up." The Camerons saw this royal gift as a slap in the face, like someone giving away your house while you're on vacation, except instead of calling a lawyer, you call a war party. King Alexander, who clearly didn't think this through, had basically handed the MacDougalls a shiny new estate, and the Camerons a giant reason to start swinging. What followed was the medieval version of the world's messiest real estate battle. The conflict blew up into full-on warfare with MacDougall and Cameron warriors raiding each other's turf like it was their day job. They torched crops with the enthusiasm of pyromaniacs who knew starvation was a great way to win swiped cattle like pros, who understood cows were basically walking bank accounts and took out enemies, with the kind of brutal efficiency that'd make even the toughest medieval warrior say, "Whoa, chill, dude." The land between their territories turned into a no-man's land, where travelers made sure their wills were up to date before passing through, and even the local wildlife learned to scatter at the sound of hoofbeats. Farmers in the area lived on high alert, ready to drop their plows and sprint to the nearest tower at the first sign of trouble, because when survival's on the line, you don't stop to ask which clan's coming for you. You just run and figure out the details later. The darkest chapter in this bloody feud hit in 1647 when MacDougall forces acting on orders from the Scottish government, because nothing screams official business like outsourcing your dirty work, to clan grudges crept up on the Cameron settlement at Glen Nevis while everyone was snoring. What went down wasn't a battle, it was a straight-up massacre. MacDougall warriors slunk through the village, slicing through dozens of Cameron men, women, and kids in their beds like they were crossing names off a hit list. The attack was carried out with the kind of cold, calculated savagery that gave clan violence its worst rep. Entire families were wiped out in their sleep, their homes torched to a crisp, and their livestock yoinked for good measure. Kids who might have grown up to keep the feud alive were taken out alongside their parents, in a grim attempt to yeet the Cameron bloodline into oblivion. The few survivors who bolted into the hills came back with horror stories so chilling they'd fuel Cameron rage for generations, like the ultimate grudge glow-up. The Glen Nevis massacre became a battle cry for the surviving Camerons and a permanent stain on the MacDougalls' record. Even for a clan used to bloodshed, many MacDougalls felt this crossed a line like, "We're cool with stabbing, but this is too much stabbing, guys." It turned their rivalry from intense dislike to, "I'd rather die than share a pint with you," and showed how clan loyalty could be weaponized by outside powers playing political chess while the Highlands burned. The Scottish government, with a hefty nudge from English interests, figured the best way to tame the rowdy Highlands was to let the clans play Hunger Games on each other, kind of like watching your worst co-workers brawl while you sip tea and take bets on the winner. It was a sneaky plan that worked because clan honor and the thirst for revenge made it basically impossible for feuding families to just shake hands and call it a day. For the regular folks caught in the crossfire, the farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who just wanted to live without playing, guess the raider life was a survival marathon that made modern stress look like a stubbed toe. At any moment, enemy clansmen could roll in like a medieval flash mob, torching crops that took months of sweat to grow swiping cattle that were basically your 401k, and leaving a trail of chaos that'd take years to fix if you even got the chance. Families lived in constant paranoia, never sure if they'd wake up to a cozy morning or their house on fire with enemy warriors at the door. Parents had to teach their kids to sleep in their clothes and know the quickest escape route to the nearest hideout life lessons. No kid should need, but in clan territory it was either learn fast or don't learn at all. Kids grew up with a crash course in Highland survival, recognizing the sound of galloping horses, figuring out if visitors were friends or foes, and learning that clan loyalty might mean one day swinging a sword at the neighbor kid you used to play tag with. It was a brutal education in a world where friend and enemy could flip faster than the weather on a Scottish mountain. Yet despite the constant threat of violence hanging over their heads, like a guillotine with a bad attitude, the clan system gave folks a sense of identity and belonging. In a world where going it alone was a one-way ticket to the grave, Being part of a clan meant you knew your place had a crew that'd have your back even when you were dead wrong, and shared a legacy that stretched back to ancestors who somehow survived the same mess you were in. The clan was a rough-around-the-edges safety net that often meant the difference between starving and scraping by. When the harvest tanked, clanmates shared their last crumbs. When raiders hit the clan turned into your personal militia. When someone got sick or hurt, the clan stepped up with care and support. It was all about mutual survival. Your well-being was tied to the groups like a medieval buddy system, where everyone's either winning or losing together. The clan also gave you a deeper sense of purpose beyond just don't die today. Being a MacDougall or a Cameron wasn't just about where you lived, it was about carrying on your ancestors' traditions, stories. And honor, like you were part of a family saga that had been running longer than any Netflix series. This belonging was cemented through epic clan traditions that kept everyone tight-knit and passed down the good stuff to the next generation. Clan gatherings were like Highland Olympics, with young guys showing off in strength and skill contests to earn props from the old-timers. Storytellers spun tales of clan heroes, keeping alive the memory of epic wins and epic fails that made the clan who they were. The clan also dished out a kind of rough justice that, while it'd make modern lawyers clutch their pearls, was way more accessible than royal courts that were miles away and didn't care about your stolen goat. Clan chiefs handled disputes, punished troublemakers, and kept the peace with rules everyone got, even if they didn't always like them. Take Duncan MacDougall, he was a pro at settling beef with a mix of wisdom and "I'll whack you if you don't behave" energy that kept his clan in check while still earning their respect. His rulings were quick, final, and often came with a side of public embarrassment for the guilty, like medieval community service, but with more humiliation. It wouldn't fly in today's courts, but it worked in a world where the alternative to clan justice was usually just chaos. Ewan Cameron, meanwhile, ran his clan like a multitasking pro-part. General part judge, part diplomat, and part therapist for clansmen, stressed out from all the fighting. His knack for keeping his crew loyal while turning them into a lean, mean fighting machine showed just how much skill it took to lead a clan in medieval Scotland. As we'll see, this fierce clan loyalty shaped Scotland's history in ways that'd make your head spin, both fueling the feuds that tore the land apart and building the tough-as-nails foundation that let the Scots survive centuries of hardship that'd crush anyone less tight-knit. The clan system, for all its chaos and bloodshed, was a survival machine perfectly tuned for one of Europe's toughest environments, like a medieval tank built out of family ties and sheer stubbornness. While clan chiefs and their warriors lived the medieval high life swinging swords and dying dramatically in what they probably thought was peak glamour, the real MVPs of medieval Scotland, the peasants, laborers, and craftsmen, were stuck in the trenches of society with about as much control over their lives as a leaf in a tornado. These folks, the backbone of the land, faced a daily grind so brutal that modern gripes about traffic jams would sound like a stand-up comedy routine. From the moment they could toddle without face-planting more than twice in a row, peasant kids were thrown into the fields, working from dawn to dusk, tending crops and livestock in a schedule that'd make modern labor laws scream in horror. They learned fast that their destiny was to slog endlessly for their lords, with the only promotion being a slim chance to upgrade from dirt poor to slightly less dirt poor. And even that required luck on par with winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. As they grew up, if they even made it past childhood, which was a gamble, when a scraped knee could turn into a one-way ticket to the afterlife, the work got tougher and riskier. Men spent grueling hours wrestling with wooden plows that were basically glorified sticks herding sheep across rocky moors where a twisted ankle could mean freezing to death and hacking peat for fuel, in bogs that had swallowed more lives than a medieval battle. By their 30s, if they were lucky enough to hit that milestone, their bodies were wrecked, spines curved like a question mark from years of hunching hands so calloused and scarred they looked like tree bark, and knees creaking louder than a haunted house door. Women, meanwhile, pulled double duty juggling field work and family life often while pregnant or nursing, because apparently medieval life wasn't hard enough without adding grow a human to the to-do list. They toiled beside their husbands in conditions that'd make modern safety inspectors faint, then dragged themselves home to wrangle kids, cook meals from ingredients that'd make a rat think twice, and manage households that were less home sweet home and more survival shack deluxe. Take Morag MacBride, a tenant farmer's wife on Clan Stewart's lands, whose daily grind made reality TV survival shows look like a five-star getaway. Before the sun even thought about rising, and in Scottish winters the sun was basically on permanent vacation. Morag would haul herself off her straw mattress, which was about as comfy as a bag of rocks with a side of splinters, to milk the clan's scrawny cows with hands so frozen they might as well have been icicles. These cows weren't the chubby, happy ones you see in modern ads. They looked like they'd been built from spare parts and fed on hopes and dreams, producing milk with all the enthusiasm of a grumpy cat and about the same output as a half-dead houseplant. Morag's menu was a snooze fest of watery porridge that tasted like sadness in a bowl, and oat cakes so hard they could double as roofing tiles. She'd occasionally jazz things up with veggies that had been bullied out of soil as fertile as a parking lot, and if the stars aligned, which happened about as often as a sunny day in Scotland, she might snag a scrap of meat or fish that hadn't yet turned into jerky. Her go-to drink, weak ale, wasn't picked for its flavor, which was basically fermented regret, but because it was safer than the local water contaminated by everything from cow poop to the odd traveler who didn't survive clan feud season. If Morag got lucky and caught the eye of a clan warrior, lucky being a stretch when your dating pool was mostly guys who excelled at stabbing, she'd be married off by 15, her dad pocketing a bride price in cows, making medieval weddings feel like a livestock trade show with extra vows. Any romantic dreams she might have had, probably sparked by some overly optimistic minstrel songs, would vanish faster than you can say one-room turf hut. She'd pop out a kid every year in a shack with the privacy of a bus stop and the comfort of a cave, because medieval birth control was about as reliable as a weather forecast from a sheep. Her home was a masterpiece of medieval misery walls of stone held together with mud and prayers, a thatched roof that leaked in 17 places every time it rained, aka every day in Scotland, and a dirt floor so packed with history it could have been a museum exhibit. This one-room wonder doubled as bedroom, kitchen, dining room, workshop, and animal pen, because medieval interior design was all about function over comfort, and whoever invented separate rooms clearly skipped Scotland. Sharing space with livestock wasn't just quirky, it was a survival hack, since the animal's body heat was the only thing keeping you from turning into a human popsicle during winters that seemed designed to make you question all your life choices. Morag lived with the constant dread of enemy raids that could turn a quiet night into a fiery nightmare faster than you could say, grab the kids and run. These weren't the swoony raids of later ballads, they were brutal smash and grabs where raiders torched what they couldn't steal, killed anyone who fought back, and burned the harvest you'd been counting on to not starve come winter. It was less adventure and more apocalypse, with a side of screaming neighbors and zero plot armor. When the men were off swinging swords because medieval guys clearly never got the memo on work-life balance, Morag would squint in the dim glow of a candle that flickered like a smartphone flashlight on its last 1% weaving coarse wool, with the focus of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. She ran the whole estate like a medieval CEO, making big calls on crop rotation and livestock breeding, bossing around other workers, and keeping the chaos at bay, all while wondering if her husband would come back with all his limbs still attached, or if he'd come back at all, or if he'd just send a postcard saying, "Got caught up in a feud, be home never." The wool came from sheep that seemed personally insulted by the idea of cozy sweaters producing fibers as soft as sandpaper and just as skin-friendly. Turning that prickly mess into something wearable was a skill passed down through generations of women who'd long ago decided comfort was a next-life problem, not a this-life priority. It was less knitting and more wrestling with a medieval torture device, but Morag made it work. Her biggest nightmare, though, was disease, which crept through villages like a shady salesman who just wouldn't take no for an answer. In a time before modern medicine, when the best treatment was a mix of prayers, sketchy herbal concoctions that might have been placebo at best, and poison at worst, and leeches slapped on for ailments that definitely didn't need leeches, even a tiny cold could turn deadly faster than you can say. Where's the nearest hospital? Measles, tuberculosis, and dysentery rolled through like medieval TikTok trends. But instead of going viral with likes, they went viral with body counts. The symptoms were gruesome, the cures were useless, and survival rates were about what you'd expect from doctors who thought humors were the key to health, like playing Operation with a blindfold and a butter knife. Tuberculosis was the slowest, cruelest guest at the party, dragging out its stay for months or even years. Victims wasted away coughing up blood while their families stood by powerless, basically praying, "Please TB, pick someone else this time." That hacking cough became such a death knell that coughing in public was bad luck, not because they knew about germs, but because it reminded everyone, "Hey, death's coming for us all, LOL." For Morag, burying another tiny frail body infant mortality was so high that some parents held off. Naming their kids until they survived a year was a gut punch so routine yet so shattering, it'd break your heart. She'd stifle her sobs as the priest mumbled prayers over a rough grave. She probably dug herself because medieval life didn't even give you a break to grieve properly. Losing a baby was extra cruel because it mixed soul-crushing grief with the practical reality that kids were both extra mouths to feed and future hands to work the fields. Parents had to love their little ones fiercely while bracing for the very real chance they wouldn't make it to 5, like the world's worst emotional tightrope walk. Medieval burials showed this harsh truth: infant graves were just a small stone or wooden cross that'd fade away in a few years. The quick ceremonies weren't from lack of love, but because survival didn't wait for morning, you had to get back to the grind or starve. The church insisted this was God's will and punishment for secret sins, which must have been super comforting for parents already juggling the logistics of tiny coffins while figuring out how to feed the kids who were still kicking. The priest would nod sagely, saying their suffering was character building, like medieval life was one big boot camp for the soul. A faithful woman like Morag could only pray her misery would earn her a heavenly VIP pass, though with the church preaching that suffering was deserved, her odds of paradise probably felt like winning a medieval lottery nobody was sure even existed. The church's take on suffering was about as helpful as a screen door on a submarine, focusing on why your pain was secretly a blessing, instead of offering actual help, like medieval toxic positivity with a side of "you probably deserved this anyway." Disease wasn't the only grim reaper knocking. Accidents were as common as midges in a Scottish summer in a world where safety regulations meant try not to die, and PPE was a quick prayer before swinging an axe. Men using janky tools in sketchy conditions racked up injuries that'd be a quick fix today, but were death sentences back then. A rusty blade nick could mean tetanus. A broken bone could leave you crippled in a world where you had to work or starve. And an infected cut was basically a game over screen. Sterile medicine was centuries away, so even well-meaning treatments often just made things worse, like trying to fix a paper cut with a flamethrower. Women faced their own gauntlet, especially during childbirth, which was about as safe as juggling flaming torches on a tightrope. Maternal death rates were sky-high, and survivors often ended up with injuries that made working and parenting even harder. Birth was handled by local women whose medical training was a mix of old wives' tales, desperate prayers, and a hope that the baby would figure it out like a medieval DIY project with the highest stakes imaginable. But even with these soul-crushing challenges that'd make most of us tap out in a day, peasant families somehow snatched moments of joy from the jaws of misery. They threw festivals to mark the seasons, feasting on whatever scraps they could spare, dancing to tunes from homemade instruments under stars that were the only reliable beauty in their brutal world. These parties were gold, because they were so rare and hard-earned. A good harvest meant you wouldn't starve, so you danced like it was your last day on Earth. A wedding wasn't just tradition. It was a big, we're still here to the universe, plus a chance to team up with another family for survival. Even tiny joys, a day's work done, a kid's giggle, a warm fire felt like winning the lottery when your life was a constant game of survive this next disaster. The Catholic Church was the medieval Scotland heavyweight champ, right up there, with the clans meddling in everyone's lives, with the persistence of a door-to-door salesman who just won't take no for an answer, and about as popular as one, too. From the poorest peasant scraping together their last penny to avoid being yeeted into eternal damnation, to the fanciest noble trying to bribe their way into heaven, with donations that got increasingly wild, everyone had to fork over cash to the church. And by had to, I mean it was as optional as breathing, but with way more guilt trips and paperwork. The church's hunger for wealth was next-level funding. The lavish lifestyles of bishops and abbots, who clearly skipped the poverty and humility part of the Bible, while their flocks were out there wondering if they'd have enough oats to survive winter. These holy rollers were feasting on dishes that'd make a modern foodie cry tears of joy, rocking robes that cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, and chilling in abbeys that were basically medieval five-star resorts with a Jesus theme. The church owned massive estates that made clan lands look like someone's backyard veggie patch, ruling over them with the efficiency of a medieval IRS if the IRS also had the power to send you to hell. Peasants worked these lands paying rent to the church just like they would to any lord, except they also got the bonus sermon about how their suffering was actually a VIP pass to spiritual growth. Lucky them, but where the church really flexed its muscle was in controlling people's thoughts and actions, with a grip so tight it'd make modern surveillance states look like they were just casually scrolling your socials. The Bible and papal decrees were the law, and stepping out of line got you punished faster than you could say, "Sorry, Father." Clan justice looked like a friendly debate compared to the church's wrath. They had a whole menu of punishments for spiritual oopsies. Heretics and blasphemers faced ecclesiastical trials that made modern courtrooms look like a group hug, risking jail and dungeons that'd make a rat file a complaint, torture that showed off medieval creativity in all the worst ways, or a fiery exit at the stake for crimes against God. Being tried as a heretic was a real treat, with interrogation methods so polished you'd confess to anything, even stuff you didn't do, like, yes, I totally danced with Satan last Tuesday. The church figured out that enough pressure, aka medieval enhanced interrogation, meant a 100% conviction rate that'd make modern DAs jealous. Leading this holy smackdown in the Highlands was Father Alasdair MacGillivray, a guy whose devotion to God was only matched by his passion for sniffing out sin like a bloodhound with a vendetta. His stare could make you confess to sins you didn't even commit, and his voice turned a simple bread blessing into a "you're going to hell" warning. Known for sermons that dragged on about how everyone was letting God down daily, Father MacGillivray could spot a moral fail from a mile away, and saw the devil in everything: kids playing tag Satan, women picking herbs for stew witchcraft. If you were having fun, you were clearly sinning, and he'd shut that party down faster than you can say amen. His church, a stone fortress that screamed, "You're insignificant," was decked out with gruesome Saint Martyrdom murals, like a medieval "don't try this at home" warning. The pews were so uncomfortable, you'd think the designer believed suffering equaled salvation. The church poked its nose into every corner of life, making modern privacy nuts faint. Marriage was a church-controlled sacrament, and getting hitched meant jumping through hoops, paying fees that always seemed to go up, navigating rules that changed faster than Scottish weather, and convincing Father MacGillivray your marriage wouldn't just be a sin factory. Divorce. Good luck, you'd have better odds convincing the rain to stop, and it only happened if you were royalty filthy rich or had proof of a miracle. defying the church's rules on sex and chastity rules so detailed they'd make you wonder why priests had so much time to think about it, meant public shaming that'd tank your rep or excommunication, which was medieval cancel culture on steroids. Excommunication didn't just mess you up, it made you a social ghost. No sacraments, no church burial, no community. Everyone, even your family, was told to ditch you, leaving you so isolated you'd beg for forgiveness just to get a hello again. But for all its give us your money or burn vibes, the church also offered some legit lifelines in a brutal world with no plan B. Abbeys and monasteries were like medieval community centers where monks and nuns dished out education, medical care, and charity with a heart that almost made up for the church's pay up or pray harder attitude. Sister Fiona Mackenzie was the church's kinder side, a woman whose compassion could melt even the grumpiest Highlander's heart. She spent her life mothering orphans, nursing the sick, and comforting families hit by medieval life's endless disasters like a one-woman Red Cross in a habit. Her convent was a safe haven where abandoned kids got food shelter and schooling, and the sick got care that, while not exactly Mayo Clinic level, came with love and skill. Sister Fiona knew her herbal remedies passed down through generations of nuns who'd seen it all from battle wounds to kitty fevers, and her treatments often meant the difference between life and death for folks with nowhere else to turn. The convent also doubled as a medieval welfare office, handing out food shelter and support to anyone in need. Sister Fiona ran it all like a pro stretching limited resources further than a medieval mom stretches a pot of porridge, all while keeping her spiritual game on point, because even saints had to multitask in medieval Scotland. But the church's good deeds were often eclipsed by folks like Bishop Roderick Sinclair, a guy whose version of Christianity seemed more about raking in cash and clout than saving souls, like a medieval influencer with a holy filter. Bishop Sinclair lived in a palace so fancy it'd make kings jealous, dripping in luxury while his flock scrounged for crumbs. He had a knack for squeezing donations out of people that was practically magic ironic for a guy who'd probably call actual magic Satan's work. His sermons were a roller coaster first. He'd guilt trip you into thinking your every sneeze was a sin. Then he'd pitch the ultimate fix cold hard cash for the church, your fast pass out of purgatory. It was a medieval pay-to-win salvation scheme that'd make today's televangelists look like they're just asking for pocket change. His palace was decked out with art and furniture worth more than his entire diocese would see in 10 lifetimes, while his staff lived better than most nobles. He'd claim all this bling was to show God's glory, but his congregation might have wondered why God's glory couldn't be shown by, say, feeding the hungry, instead of ordering another golden chalice for the collection. The church's worldly power also bred corruption and hypocrisy so thick you could cut it with a sword. If anyone was surprised, it was only because they'd stopped being shocked ages ago. Church jobs were bought and sold like hot potatoes, with rich families snagging bishop gigs for their spare sons who weren't cut out for the stabby career path of medieval nobles. These pay-to-pray leaders cared more about keeping their coin and influence than guiding souls. Creating a church that preached poverty while swimming in riches, demanded humility while strutting like peacocks, and insisted on morality while doing stuff that'd make even the shadiest politicians go, "Whoa, that's a bit much." The church also had a top-notch heresy hunting squad with a playbook for sniffing out bad thoughts that they'd perfected over centuries, like medieval thought police with extra holy water. Accusations of heresy could come from anyone, your neighbor, your ex, even your dog. If it could talk and were investigated with the assumption you were guilty until proven innocent, which was tough when innocent meant proving your soul was pure. Good luck with that. The church's biggest obsession was witchcraft, a paranoia-fueled witch hunt, literally that mixed religious zeal with what can only be called medieval conspiracy theories gone wild. They claimed witches sold their souls to Satan for powers that caused everything from rotten crops to weird rashes to sudden storms. Basically, if anything went wrong in medieval life, which was always a witch did it. With so much evidence lying around, accusing someone was as easy as pointing a finger, and proving you weren't a witch was harder than convincing a sheep to join a book club. Women got the worst of it, especially if they lived alone, knew some herbal remedies, or just seemed weird. The church was super suspicious of women claiming they were basically Satan's BFFs and needed constant male supervision by priests who apparently had anti-demon superpowers. Witch trials weren't about finding the truth. They were about getting you to confess whether you were guilty or not. Torture was the go-to method, and you had two options. Admit you were a witch and maybe get a quick death, or hold out and endure pain until you either caved or checked out permanently, like a medieval game show where everyone loses. But for all its shady antics that'd make modern folks gasp, the medieval church was also the only game in town for education, healthcare, and welfare, in a world where those things were rarer than a sunny Scottish day. Monasteries kept ancient knowledge alive when most people couldn't read their own name. Monks and nuns offered the closest thing to a doctor's visit. Think leeches and prayers instead of antibiotics, and church charities were the only safety net for the poor and homeless, like a medieval GoFundMe with more incense. While the clans were busy turning violence into their own personal art project, and the church was squeezing the population's souls and coin purses with the zeal of a medieval Black Friday sale, a new storm was brewing down south, literally a storm cloud with a grudge and a crown. The English kings had been eyeballing Scotland's lands and riches for ages, treating it like a scruffy backyard they were destined to civilize, whether the Scots RSVP'd to that party or not. The English had cooked up a handy little theory that Scotland was theirs by right, thanks to some dusty old claims, sketchy history lessons, and the golden rule of medieval real estate. If you've got more swords, you're the landlord. They saw the Scottish clans as rowdy toddlers in need of a timeout from their English parents, completely ignoring the fact that these kids were armed to the teeth and had very strong feelings about outsiders meddling in their family drama. In 1296, Edward I of England, aka Longshanks, a nickname earned from his tall frame and his even taller ability to hold a grudge, decided it was time to crash Scotland's independence party with a full-blown invasion. Edward was the kind of king who thought diplomacy was just a fancy word for invade, first talk later, and he figured Scotland had had enough freedom for 1 millennium, thank you very much. His armies rolled over the border like a medieval wrecking crew, flattening towns and villages with the precision of pros who'd majored in destruction. They didn't just beat Scottish resistance, they erased it with the kind of brutal flair meant to make future rebels think, maybe we should just stick to knitting. The Scots were caught napping by the sheer speed and scale of this invasion facing an enemy, with more troops, better gear, and a level of organization that made Scottish battle plans look like a kid's game of tag. Their king John Balliol got nabbed and forced to abdicate in a ceremony so humiliating it was basically medieval public shaming. His crown handed to Edward like a shiny I-win trophy, to remind everyone who was the new boss in town. Scotland was now under English rule, with foreign laws enforced by foreign officials who understood Scottish traditions about as well as they understood quantum physics and cared even less. The English set up a colonial regime that treated Scotland like a conquered prize, slapping on taxes, laws, and governors with the finesse of a bull in a china shop. But the Scots, who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of being ungovernable even on a good day, weren't about to roll over and play nice for English overlords who couldn't tell a clan chief from a sheep farmer, and probably didn't care to learn. In the years that followed, rebellions erupted like medieval popcorn shaking English control, like a series of political earthquakes led by bold, larger-than-life figures who became legends because they embodied the kind of "we've got nothing left to lose" bravery that only comes from being pushed to the brink. One such hero was Sir Malcolm MacIntyre, a knight from the Western Highlands whose family had ruled lands near Loch Katrina for generations, until the English showed up with their "we own this now" nonsense. Malcolm wasn't exactly rolling in noble riches. His family's castle was more of a beefy house with big dreams, but he had a fiery passion for Scottish freedom and a deep loathing for invaders who thought they could waltz in and tell him how to run his ancestral turf. Malcolm watched English soldiers torch his family's lands, kill his tenants, and slap on taxes that seemed less about raising cash and more about flexing English power like a medieval because we can move. And he saw neighbors forced to swear loyalty to a foreign king who treated Scotland like his personal playground. And he witnessed the systematic shredding of the Highland way of life that had kept communities going for centuries. The last straw came when English officials demanded his younger brother fight in Edward's army for a French campaign, basically turning a Scottish noble into cannon fodder for England's side quests. Malcolm's response. He rounded up a posse and kicked off one of the slickest guerrilla campaigns in medieval history. Malcolm's fighting style was straight out of the Highland playbook of cattle raids and clan feuds, where Scots had mastered the art of hit hard, run fast, and vanish into terrain that'd make a GPS cry. He knew taking on English armies head-on was a fancy way to commit group suicide. They had too many troops, too much gear, and too much experience for that to end well. Instead, Malcolm and his crew invented what we'd now call guerrilla warfare, though back then they just called it making the English wish they'd stayed home. They ambushed supply convoys in Highland passes, raided lonely garrisons at night, and jumped patrols with the kind of sudden chaos that had lowland farmers quaking in their boots for generations. Malcolm's biggest flex was the Battle of Glen Crow, where his tiny band turned a narrow mountain pass into a medieval death trap for a much larger English army. The English, cocky with their overwhelming numbers and apparently clueless that local know-how beats brute force, marched into the glen in a formation perfect for open fields, but about as useful in the Highlands as a chocolate sword. Malcolm's crew funneled them into a kill zone where their big army became their biggest problem, like trying to herd cats. But the cats are armed Scots and the herders are sitting ducks. Malcolm waited until the English column was stretched out like a clueless conga line along the narrow valley floor, then pounced from both sides with his crew, who'd spent the night sneaking into position, using their "we know every rock and tree" superpowers. The English were trapped in a valley tighter than a medieval corset, unable to flex their big numbers, while Scottish archers and spearmen rained chaos from spots with perfect cover and killer sightlines, like a medieval sniper squad with extra plaid. The battle wasn't a fair fight, it was a masterclass in welcome to our turf suckers. English knights in their fancy heavy armor learned the hard way that their gear, great for flat fields, was about as useful on steep rocky slopes as a ball gown at a mud wrestling match, especially with Scots zipping around like murderous mountain goats. By day's end, hundreds of English soldiers were strewn across the glen, their gear scattered like a yard sale of what not to do in the Highlands. Malcolm's crew barely broke a sweat snagging enough weapons and supplies to arm more rebels, proving that sometimes knowing the lay of the land and a bit of sneaky genius can trump even the biggest army. The win at Glen Crow turned Malcolm into a Scottish rock star, a symbol of "we're not going down" without a fight that sparked songs, stories, and more rebellions for generations. More importantly, it showed the English that their "we own Scotland" victory lap was premature, like thinking you've won a marathon but forgetting there's a bear chasing you for the last mile. Malcolm's success also got other Scottish nobles off the fence, like Sir Kenneth Douglas from the Borders, who'd lost heaps of land to English grabby hands, and joined Malcolm with his own crew, and Lady Margaret Sinclair, whose husband got the chop for not bowing to Edward, and who fed Malcolm intel on English moves like a medieval spy queen. But Malcolm's victory party didn't last long, because King Edward wasn't the type to take a loss with a smile and a good game. The next year, Edward rolled up with a massive army ready to squash the rebellion so hard, future rebels would think twice, like bringing a tank to a pillow fight. At the Battle of Loudoun Hill, English longbowmen, Basically, medieval snipers with attitude turned Malcolm's Highland spearmen into pincushions, showing why guerrilla fighters usually avoided open battles with pros who brought better toys and training. The Scottish schiltrons, those spiky spear formations that worked great in clan scraps, were sitting ducks for English archers who could pick them off from so far away, the Scots might as well have been throwing harsh words instead of spears. Malcolm's men, brave as they were, dropped like flies before even getting close their old-school tactics, as useful against longbows as a paper shield in a thunderstorm. Malcolm barely escaped when his position got swarmed, but his army scattered like confetti and his unbeatable guerrilla legend status took a bigger hit than his troops. Loudoun Hill was a harsh wake-up call that guts and local know-how, while awesome, couldn't always beat more guys, better gear, and military pros who'd clearly read the How to Win Wars manual. After Malcolm's rebel squad got smashed, English rule got nastier like a bully who just found out you snitched. Administrators who'd hoped to govern through a bit of teamwork turned to scorched earth tactics instead, forcing Scottish nobles to swear loyalty oaths so humiliating they might as well have been in a medieval roast, and plopping English governors in charge with all the charm of a military dictator. The common folk got the worst of it with their crops, and livestock nabbed to feed English armies, their homes torched if they even looked like they might have helped a rebel, and their young guys drafted into English wars that had zero to do with Scotland, like being forced to fight for your neighbor's drama while your own house burns down. The economy tanked harder than a medieval stock market, with trade routes messed up Scottish merchants stuck under English laws that screamed England first, and Scotland's cash siphoned off to pay for English armies and fancy governor hats. But even in these grim times when fighting back seemed as smart as wrestling a bear in your undies, little sparks of hope kept the Scottish spirit alive. In abbeys and priories across the land, monks and nuns were like medieval superheroes, giving shelter and support to the poor, and hunted, dishing out prayers and practical help to folks with nowhere else to go. The church, despite its own messy politics and occasional English bootlicking, kept a Scottish vibe that held the culture together when everything else was falling apart. Scottish religious leaders, careful not to poke the English bear too hard, still preserved traditions, guarded cultural treasures, and kept the We're Scots darn. It flamed burning for future fights. One standout was Sister Catherine MacLeod, whose convent near Stirling turned into a sneaky hub of Keep Scotland Scottish vibes, born into a noble family before going full nun mode. Sister Catherine used her gig to hide Scottish refugees, save Scottish manuscripts and traditions, and teach kids in their native tongue like a medieval cultural ninja. She had to play it cool to avoid getting her convent shut down, or her head on a spike, but her place became a safe space where Scottish identity could hunker down while political freedom was on life support. Meanwhile, in the Highlands and far-off spots where English control was more on paper than in practice, others kept the rebel dream alive. Merchants like Hamish Macpherson used their trade routes to smuggle messages between Scottish communities like a medieval pony express with extra secrecy, and clan leaders like Donald Cameron kept their folks loyal while dodging English fights like playing hide-and-seek with a dragon. The English occupation, as brutal as it was, accidentally did something funny. It united Scots who'd spent forever bickering with each other, showing them that clan beefs aside, they were all Scots under the same miserable English boot. This slow-burn sense of we're all in this together would be the secret sauce years later when, after oppression that pushed Scottish grit to the brink, a new leader stepped up with the brains, charm, and sheer stubbornness to turn scattered rebels into a full-on revolution. That guy was King Robert MacAlpin, later dubbed Robert the Bruce, whose mix of noble blood military wizardry and I'm not giving up energy finally gave the Scots the leader they needed to grab the independence that seemed like a fever dream during the darkest days of English rule. Just as the survivors of botched rebellions were picking up the pieces of their shattered lives, and the English were tightening their grip on Scotland like it was their shiny new toy, a new disaster rolled in that made clan wars and English invasions look like a picnic gone wrong. In 1348, death itself showed up with a dramatic entrance, courtesy of the Black Death hitching a ride on merchant ships from Europe like the worst surprise package ever, next day delivery straight to doom. The Black Death slinked into Scotland's port towns like a sneaky thief in the night, then spread through the countryside faster than gossip at a clan wedding, outpacing even the most efficient English invasion. This wasn't an enemy you could stab with a sword or outsmart with a clever ambush. It was a sneaky, invisible killer that didn't care if you were a peasant or a lord, and seemed hell-bent on testing just how much misery Scotland could handle before throwing in the towel. The first cases popped up in Edinburgh and other coastal towns where ships regularly rolled in with goodies from plague-ravaged Europe, though the merchants had no clue they'd just imported a disaster worse than any army. At first, the symptoms seemed like no big deal by medieval standards, fever chills and a general, ugh, I feel awful vibe that could have been blamed on any of the usual medieval bugs that hit people, whose healthcare was mostly pray and hope for the best. But within days, the plague dropped its mask and showed its true colors with the horrifying buboes, big black swollen lumps in armpits and groins that gave the disease its name and screamed, "Your body hates you now." These nasty swellings came with screaming pain, sky-high fevers that turned folks into delirious hot messes, and a body shutdown so gruesome even medieval doctors who'd seen some stuff were like, nope, I'm out. The plague didn't mess around, usually killing its victims within a week of the first sniffle, though that week felt like a year to folks experiencing what was basically medieval germ warfare. Some dropped dead even faster, checking out in days or even hours, while others hung on for weeks in agony, as if the disease was designed by a particularly petty demon with a grudge against humanity. Leading the frantic, "What do we do?" response was physician Ian McQuarrie, a guy whose medical training covered the usual medieval hits, broken bones, oozing wounds, and the gross stuff that came from living in filth, but nothing in his fancy Paris education prepped him for a disease that killed faster than he could say. Maybe try some leeches. Ian had learned the best medieval healing tricks like bloodletting, slapping leeches on everything, and balancing humors with methods that usually left patients worse off, like prescribing a double dose of misery. He was a surgical rock star by medieval standards, meaning he could chop off limbs without killing most of his patients, and sometimes fixed battlefield wounds without them turning septic, basically a 50-50 success rate that made him a legend. But the Black Death laughed in the face of Ian's skills. He watched helplessly as his patients croaked despite his best efforts, their bodies breaking down in ways that made his medical knowledge look like a bad joke. His go-to treatments didn't just fail, they seemed to speed up the dying, leaving Ian wondering if he was accidentally on Team Plague. The disease tore through communities that had already survived clan wars, English occupation, and every other medieval disaster, showing just how fragile humanity was against an enemy you couldn't bribe, negotiate with, or whack with a sword. Whole families vanished in days. Their homes turned into creepy ghost houses filled with bodies nobody dared touch, because who'd risk catching the medieval cooties? The unlucky guy who brought this nightmare to Scotland was Callum MacPherson, a big-shot trader whose ship had just come back from Flanders, loaded with fancy wool exotic spices and oops plague-infested rats. Callum had built his business with smart, sharp deals and an eye for detail that made him one of Scotland's top merchants, but he never dreamed his success would make him the guy who accidentally kicked off a national disaster like winning Employee of the Month, but for the apocalypse. His ship, the Seawolf, docked in Leith Harbor on a crisp autumn morning, the crew itching to unload their haul and hit the town after weeks at sea. The rats that scampered ashore with the cargo seemed like a minor annoyance. Every port had rats, right? Not the four-legged harbingers of doom they turned out to be. Within weeks of the Seawolf's arrival, the plague had spread from Edinburgh to the countryside, faster than you could say, wash your hands, making English invasions look like they were moving in slow motion. Villages that had survived centuries of Highland drama were ghost towns in months with survivors fleeing from an enemy they couldn't see, understand, or fight like running from a horror movie monster, but without the popcorn. The response to this medieval mega-crisis showed Scotland at its best and worst, like a reality TV show where some contestants team up to share the last stale oatcake, while others start accusing each other of witchcraft faster than you can say pass the ale. Some communities banded together sharing what little they had and nursing the sick, even though it was riskier than playing tag with a wild boar, while others spiraled into panic and finger-pointing that made the plague's job easier, like handing it a welcome to Scotland gift basket. Religious leaders like village elder Sorcha MacLeod tried to keep things together, comforting the dying with prayers and a pat on the back, but their usual gods got a plan. Playbook felt about as useful as a paper umbrella in a Highland storm when death was knocking on every door. Sorcha had spent her whole adult life as the community's crisis queen, steering them through crop flops, clan raids, English tax grabs, and the usual medieval mess that passed for normal. She was known for keeping her cool under pressure, whipping up solid game plans for emergencies, and dishing out wisdom that only comes from decades of helping folks survive the unsurvivable. But the plague was a whole new level of nope. Even Sorcha's crisis management skills were stretched thinner than a peasant's porridge. The usual community fixes sharing food, housing the homeless, caring for the sick, turned into a deadly game of guess who's next, when the disaster was a contagious plague that turned every handshake into a potential death sentence. Sorcha watched her tight-knit community unravel faster than a cheap kilt. As fear took over, neighbors stopped helping each other's support systems, crumbled under the weight of, "I'm not touching that guy." And the Highland bonds that had survived centuries of chaos just couldn't handle a threat that made being a good neighbor a one-way ticket to the grave. The plague's impact on Scotland was worse than anything a sword-swinging army could dream up. Chroniclers who lived to scribble about it guess Scotland lost a third of its people, a population drop so massive it'd take generations to bounce back, reshaping society more than any war or king ever could. Whole villages turned into ghost towns, their empty houses crumbling as nature said, thanks for the free real estate fields that families had worked for centuries, went wild for lack of hands, while cows and sheep roamed free in a countryside that went from bustling to zombie apocalypse vibes in just a few years. The economy took a nosedive, trade routes collapsed when the merchants running them kicked the bucket craft guilds, couldn't function with half their members gone, and the medieval, "You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours" system fell apart when there weren't enough backs left to scratch. Markets that had been hopping for centuries went quieter than a mouse in a cat convention. Roads got swallowed by weeds without enough travelers to keep them clear, and once thriving farm regions turned into creepy abandoned wastelands dotted with sad empty villages. The plague also flipped the economy in the weirdest ways, like a medieval plot twist nobody saw coming. With so many people gone, surviving workers suddenly became the hot new commodity, demanding wages that would have been a pipe dream before. Peasants who'd been tied to their lord's land found their labor was now worth its weight in gold, while craftsmen could basically name their price like medieval gig workers hitting the jackpot. But this raise came with a catch. The social devastation left survivors rattling around in communities that had lost their glue. Family, clan, and neighbor ties that had weathered every storm were shredded when whole families died, clans fell apart without leaders, and neighborhoods turned into scattered clumps of shell-shocked survivors instead of actual communities. The mental toll was even worse than the body count. Survivors were hit with grief so massive it made clan wars, and English rule looked like a bad day at the market. People who'd lived through every medieval disaster found themselves drowning in loss on a scale they couldn't fathom, like trying to process a whole season of a medieval soap opera in one episode. The usual religious excuses for suffering: it's God's punishment, it's a faith test, it purifies your soul, rang hollow when the plague wiped out entire towns without caring if you were a saint or a sinner, a churchgoer or a slacker. It killed everyone equally. ignoring medieval ideas of divine justice like a rude guest who doesn't RSVP. Many survivors were left with what we'd now call major trauma, though medieval folks just noticed some people were off, after seeing horrors that'd make a modern therapist's jaw drop, without any idea how to help them. Communities built on teamwork and shared struggles were now full of folks who'd seen too much to just go back to normal, like trying to host a cheerful clan gathering after half the guest list got wiped out by a mystery bug. Yet somehow these battered Scots started the slow crawl back to normalcy. They buried their dead in mass graves when digging individual ones got too real, scavenged what they could from ghost towns, and began stitching their broken world back together like medieval DIYers with a side of grit. The plague, for all its chaos, accidentally gave the Scots a break from English control, since English admins and troops dropped like flies just as fast as the locals, like a grim game of who's next with no winners. The colonial government, which had seemed so rock solid, was suddenly understaffed and scrambling to keep a lid on a population that, while smaller, was also less scared of a foreign boss who couldn't even beat a germ. As Scotland crawled out from under the Black Death's grim shadow, looking like a medieval zombie who'd just survived a fever that almost sent them to the great clan gathering in the sky, the survivors found themselves in a world where old rivalries got spicier and new drama popped up like uninvited guests at a Highland Sealy. The plague had been the ultimate equal opportunity killer, taking out Highland chiefs and lowland merchants with the enthusiasm of a kid with a new slingshot, but its aftermath cracked open cultural divides that would keep Scotland buzzing with tension for centuries, like a medieval reality show with no commercial breaks. The gap between the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and the Scots-speaking Lowlands was older than a bard's favorite ballad, but the plague turned it into a full-blown canyon, like two siblings who'd been bickering for years, but now couldn't even agree on how to survive the apocalypse. To the Lowlanders, who'd always looked at their Highland neighbors like they were one kilt away from living in a cave, the northern clans seemed even weirder and wilder after the disaster hit both regions, but sent them spinning in totally different directions. The Lowlanders, who'd been sipping the European culture Kool-Aid and borrowing English admin tricks, tackled recovery like they were auditioning for medieval efficiency idol. They set up relief efforts through their fancy institutions, tried to restart trade with the few merchants who hadn't croaked, and rebuilt their towns with the kind of planning that screamed, "We've got spreadsheets for days." To them, this was proof that civilized folks who knew how to file paperwork could beat any disaster with a good plan and a smug grin. They basically saw themselves as the adults in the room, expecting the Highlands to take notes and bow down to their superior vibes. Meanwhile, the Highlanders handled the plague's mess by clinging to traditions that had gotten them through every disaster since forever. But to the Lowlanders, it looked like they were one step away from sacrificing goats to the moon goddess. When Highland communities lost their leaders, they picked new ones the old school way, going for swagger, bravery, and clan loyalty, over boring stuff like, "Can you read?" Or "Do you know what a tax is like?" choosing a new chief based on who could yell the loudest at a clan party. Leading this Highland "We're doing it our way" parade was Chieftain Torquil MacNeil, whose clan ruled the Outer Hebrides with the stubbornness of a mule who's heard about glue factories. Torquil was the kind of leader who thought the old ways were the best, because they'd survived everything life threw at them, like a medieval grandpa who swears his rusty sword is better than any newfangled armor. He spoke only Gaelic, even though he could have learned other languages because he figured his ancestors' tongue was good enough for anything worth saying, like why bother with Scots when Gaelic can say you're an idiot? Just fine. He rocked traditional Highland gear not as a tourist trap, but because he genuinely thought it was better than silly foreign nonsense, both for keeping warm and looking like a total legend. His stronghold on the Isle of Barra was built the ancient way, all about defense and clan vibes over comfort, or less impress the neighbors. Think less cozy Airbnb and more fortress where you sleep with one eye open. Under Torquil's lead, the MacNeil clan didn't just survive the plague, they kept their old school ways basically untouched, which Torquil saw as proof that Highland grit beat Lowland. We need a committee fragility any day. His folks stuck to Gaelic settled beefs with clan law instead of fancy courts, and kept their economy rolling with cattle fishing and a bit of farming, like a medieval survival show where they'd already won the immunity challenge. Torquil bragged that the plague actually proved Highland traditions were the real MVPs. They'd always been self-sufficient, so they didn't get slammed by the trade crashes that left lowlanders crying into their porridge, and their clan setup gave them a support system that helped them ride out the worst, like having a family plan that actually works during a zombie apocalypse. This Highland, we're good thanks attitude had lowland bigwigs like Lord Kenneth Stewart sweating bullets. His family had spent generations playing cultural Cupid between the Highlands and Lowlands, but now he was watching his hard work unravel faster than a kilt in a windstorm. Kenneth was the ultimate middleman, schooled in Paris, fluent in multiple languages, and savvy in both Highland clan law and modern admin stuff, making him the perfect guy to play translator between two groups who seemed hell-bent on misreading each other. His estate on the Highland-Lowland border had always been a chill spot where both sides could grab a dram and chat without drama, but now even his safe space was feeling the tension, like hosting a dinner party where half the guests are ready to duel over the last oatcake. Kenneth saw good stuff in both sides' recovery plans and thought they could mash it up for a win-win, but that sensible take was getting harder to sell as both groups dug in, each convinced they were the medieval masterminds. He watched Highlanders like Torquil get even more old ways, or nothing, while Lowlanders doubled down on thinking Highland customs were why they couldn't have nice things, like two kids fighting over who gets to steer the clan cart, but with more kilts and less sharing. The language barrier turned into a full-on mess with Gaelic and Scots speakers struggling to talk about recovery without sounding like they were playing a bad game of medieval charades. This wasn't just a hassle, it was sparking real beef as each side filtered the other's actions through their own cultural lens, which was about as accurate as a drunk bard's battle tale. Trying to fix this hot mess was Niall MacArthur, a language genius who grew up in a border town where both Gaelic and Scots were spoken, giving him the superpower of thinking in both like a medieval Google Translate with a kilt. Niall wasn't just translating words, he was decoding whole cultural vibes, helping Highland and Lowland leaders get each other even when they seemed to be speaking different planets. Niall saw firsthand how language shaped everything. Gaelic and Scots didn't just use different words, they thought differently, valued different stuff, and made assumptions that were often at total odds. For example, when Highland chiefs talked clan loyalty, they meant a deep web of duties, family ties, and we're all in this together, vibes honed over centuries, in tiny remote spots where you either stuck together or died alone, like a medieval group hug with swords. But when Lowlanders heard loyalty, they thought political contract something you could negotiate, tweak, or ditch if the deal changed, like swapping teams in a medieval fantasy league without the drama. These clashing mindsets meant Highland and Lowland leaders could nod at the same idea while completely missing the other's vibe, or argue over details while secretly wanting the same thing. Except they expressed it in ways so different, it was like one was speaking in bagpipe solos and the other in tax forms. Niall's job as translator got tougher as both sides doubled down, acting like their differences were a medieval talent show where the prize was bragging rights. Highland leaders started claiming their old-school ways weren't just different, they were better, like choosing a trusty claymore over a fancy quill. Meanwhile, Lowland bosses were convinced Highland traditions were the equivalent of using carrier pigeons in a world of parchment memos. Cute, but time to grow up, lads. The economic ties between Highland and Lowland Scotland, which had always been the let's-get-along glue, despite their cultural squabbles, turned into a sticky mess as both regions scrambled to recover from the plague's beatdown. The cattle trade, the MVP of their economic bromance, got wrecked when there weren't enough cows or cowherders left to keep the deals moving. Highlanders who'd sold cattle to Lowland merchants suddenly had fewer cows to trade, and shakier access to markets, like trying to sell your prized sheep at a market where half the buyers are ghosts. Lowland merchants who'd built their empires on Highland beef found their suppliers either dead displaced or showing up with 3 cows instead of 30, like ordering a feast and getting a crumb. This economic mess fueled cultural beef as Highland and Lowland folks started fighting over scraps instead of hashing things out over a dram like the good old days. The "we're in this together" vibe that had kept them playing nice turned into a survival showdown that made their differences seem bigger than they're shared. We're all Scots spirit. Highland self-sufficiency, which used to be balanced by Lowland trade, got a big boost as leaders like Torquil MacNeil preached that the plague proved outsiders were trouble, like saying, "See, we should have stuck to our own oats." From his view, Highlanders would be safer focusing on their old-school survival tricks instead of betting on trade networks that could collapse faster than a thatched roof in a storm. Lowland leaders, on the other hand, were all about doubling down on trade to get the economy back on track, arguing that both sides could win by specializing and teaming up like a medieval co-op where everyone brings something to the table. They saw Highland, "We don't need you" vibes as a step backward, like refusing to use a wheel because your ancestors carried stuff on their backs. Adorable, but let's move on, folks. Religion added another layer of drama to this Highland-Lowland soap opera, as both sides wrestled with why God had sent such a brutal smackdown. Highland faith, which mixed Christianity with ancient Celtic vibes, spun the plague as part of life's big cycle. Like stuff happens, we rebuild, rinse, repeat. They stressed keeping peace with nature, accepting God's mysterious ways, even when those ways seemed like a cosmic prank. Lowland church folks who'd spent ages trying to make Scottish faith more European fancy saw the plague as a divine pop quiz on faith time, to double down on proper teachings, and scrub out any pagan leftovers that might have ticked God off. They eyed Highland spiritual mashups as a red flag, like leaving the door open for more divine smiting. Like maybe if you stopped dancing with druids, we'd all be fine. These religious clashes made teamwork even harder as each side's plague story basically threw shade at the other's beliefs. Highlanders hinted the Lowlands got hit hard because they ditched nature's rules, while Lowlanders whispered the Highlands suffered because they hadn't fully Christianed up like a medieval blame game with extra incense. To make things messier, generational drama started brewing in both camps. Younger Highlanders who'd watched their old remedies fail against the plague started sneaking peeks at Lowland medicine like maybe their leech guy knows something we don't. Meanwhile, some young Lowlanders, after seeing their trade networks flop harder than a soggy oat cake, started giving Highland self-sufficiency some props. Like, hey, maybe growing our own food isn't such a bad idea. These generational splits turned both cultures into family feuds, where some wanted to stick to how we've always done it, while others were ready to borrow from the other team, like a medieval old school versus new school rap battle. The political stakes of this cultural chaos were huge, as Scottish leaders tried to rebuild a nation that could handle both Highland and Lowland vibes, without making either side ditch their core identity, like trying to plan a clan gathering where half the guests want a formal banquet and the other half want to roast a cow in a field. The plague had shown Scotland needed to team up to survive, but that teamwork was getting trickier as cultural divides grew deeper, fueled by clashing recovery styles, like trying to rebuild a castle when one crew's using ancient stone magic, and the other's got a blueprint and a ruler. While clan chiefs and fancy lords were busy with their cultural squabbles and political drama, the real MVPs of medieval Scotland were battling a foe so relentless it made English invasions look like a friendly pop in the land itself, and a climate that seemed cooked up by a grumpy god who thought, let's see how much these Scots can take before they cry. Uncle Scottish weather, even on a good day, was as predictable as a toddler on a sugar high, and about as gentle as a rabid badger. Back then, Scotland's climate was even meaner than today's, thanks to the Little Ice Age, though medieval folks just called it Tuesday, since they had no clue what normal weather even looked like. Winters stretched from October to April, sometimes overstaying their welcome into spring. Like that one guest who doesn't get the hint when the party's over. The cold wasn't just brrr, I need a scarf. It was a full-on you might die if you step outside situation that modern folks with their toasty heaters can't even wrap their heads around. Temps dropped below freezing for months, turning basic chores like grabbing water or feeding the cows into Arctic-level missions that needed more planning than a Viking raid. Leading the charge to outsmart this frosty nightmare was Morag MacBride, a woman whose weather-predicting skills made her the local oracle of the Highlands, except her forecasts were way more accurate than the church's Goddle sorted out and actually helped people not die. Mary had learned her tricks from her granny, who'd gotten them from generations of Highland women who turned weather watching into a survival art like medieval meteorologists with better instincts and fewer gadgets. She could spot a storm coming by, watching birds act twitchy, feeling the wind shift like it had a grudge checking the sunset cloud's mood, and a dozen other nature hacks passed down by folks whose lives depended on knowing if the sky was about to throw a tantrum. Her predictions weren't perfect. Medieval weather apps were a few centuries off, but they were good enough to give her village a heads up when Mother Nature was about to go full drama queen. Mary knew that if wild geese flew in funky patterns, a nasty storm was 2 days out, like nature's version of a batten down the hatches text. When the cows huddled by certain rocks like they were planning a secret meeting, a cold snap was coming faster than you could say, "Where's my cloak?" And if certain plants started acting shy, closing up their leaves or flowers at weird times, a downpour was on the way that could wash away crops, flood homes, and turn a trip to the market into a hope-you-can-swim adventure. Mary's weather smarts were a lifesaver, because Scottish winters didn't mess around. They'd take out the unprepared faster than you can say I should have listened to Mary. Hypothermia was always lurking for anyone dumb enough to step out without enough layers. Frostbite nibbled at fingers and toes like a hungry rat, and just being outside too long could kill you if your clothes and shelter weren't up to the challenge, like nature's way of saying dress warm or die trying. The endless winters weren't just a physical beatdown, they messed with your head too. Seasonal depression, though they didn't have a name for it, hit hard, leaving folks moping, dragging their feet and feeling like spring was a myth, and winter was their new forever, like living in a snow globe that someone forgot to stop shaking. Fighting this natural chaos was Glen MacBride, a farmer whose constant battles with Scotland's climate made him a pro at agricultural failure. He'd have given modern doomsday preppers a run for their money. Gregor inherited a tiny plot that in a sane climate might have fed his family, but in medieval Scotland's good luck conditions, it demanded non-stop work, backbreaking effort, and the kind of luck you only get from finding a four-leaf clover in a blizzard. The growing season was shorter than a Highland summer fling, 4 months if you were lucky less, if the weather decided to be extra spicy. Gregor had to plant his crops in spring while crossing his fingers that late frosts wouldn't turn his seedlings into popsicles, then spend summer praying the rain wouldn't drown his plants, while also stressing that a drought might turn his fields into a dust bowl, like playing a medieval farming simulator on nightmare mode. The soil itself was a nightmare, thin, rocky, and sour enough to make farming feel like betting your life savings on a coin toss. Gregor spent half his life hauling rocks out of his fields, only for winter frosts to shove new ones up like the land was trolling him with an endless surprise, more rocks prank. Even when his crops somehow grew, despite the dirt and weather, they were sitting ducks for plant diseases, bugs, and blights that could wipe out months of work faster than you can say we're doomed. Gregor got good at spotting trouble, yellow leaves, weird growth, creepy crawlies, but his medieval fix-it options were about as useful as a paper umbrella in a monsoon. One bad harvest meant starvation, and a string of flops could wipe out his whole family since they had zero backup, like playing Russian roulette with oats instead of bullets. Scottish weather seemed to have a personal grudge against farmers, dumping buckets of rain when crops needed a sprinkle, then ghosting with droughts when plants were gasping for a drink. Seasons played hide-and-seek with spring, showing up late, and winter crashing in, early shrinking, an already tiny growing window like nature's way of saying, "Hope you like surprises." Up in the Highlands above Gregor's struggling farm was Coinage MacIver, a shepherd who knew mountain weather like the back of his hand after years of keeping his flock alive in conditions that'd make an Arctic explorer cry for their mama. Coinage's sheep were tough Highland breeds built to survive the madness, but even these woolly tanks needed constant babysitting from weather that could turn deadly faster than you can say, "Where's my flock?" Like herding cats, but the cats are sheep and the floor is ice. Highland weather was even more chaotic than the lowlands, with storms popping up out of nowhere and temps dropping faster than a bard's reputation after a bad rhyme. Coinage MacIver had learned to read the signs like a weather whisperer, feeling air pressure shifts in his creaky joints like a human barometer, noticing wind changes that screamed storms coming pal, and watching his sheep act twitchier than a clan chief at a tax meeting when danger was near. His survival game plan was knowing every cave rock hideout and sheltered valley like a medieval GPS, so he could herd his flock to safety when the weather turned deadly, like a sheep's personal superhero, but with more wool and less cape. The sheep had their own survival instincts, but they still needed Coinage's VIP guidance to find the best spots when storms hit, with the ferocity of a Highland tantrum, like a flash mob of rain wind, and you're on your own, buddy. Coinage was out in all of it, braving cold wind, rain, and snow that'd send anyone less prepared running for their mama. His gear was medieval survival couture layers of wool that kept him warm, even when soaked waterproof leather outerwear that laughed at the rain, and boots that gripped icy rocks better than modern hiking gear, while keeping his feet dry like a Highland fashion icon who prioritized not dying over looking cute. The mental toll of his job was as brutal as the physical grind Coinage spent most of his time solo, in conditions that'd make a hermit cry babysitting sheep, whose lives depended on his constant, "don't mess this up" focus. The isolation was rough, especially in winter when storms could cut him off from other humans for weeks, like being the last guy at a party where everyone else left, but the party's a blizzard, and there's no ale. Scottish winters also brought health woes medieval folks felt but couldn't name. Vitamin D shortages from the endless gloom gave kids rickets and adults bone issues, while the lack of sunlight turned everyone into moody, sluggish grumps, like living in a world where the sun ghosted you for months. Scurvy sneaked in during winter when fresh fruits and veggies were as rare as a sunny day, leaving folks with bleeding gums, wobbly teeth, and weakness that could kill like nature's way of saying, "Hope you like oatmeal because that's all you're getting." Respiratory bugs like pneumonia and flu ran wild in cramped, smoky homes with zero ventilation and barely any heat, spreading faster than gossip at a clan gathering, like a medieval germ party with no RSVP. Chilblains, trench foot, and other cold injuries were so common they were just winter perks. Not actual problems like, "Oh, my toes are black again, must be December." The economic hit from this brutal weather was a gut punch for folks already scraping by. Harsh winters could wipe out livestock that were a family's whole bank account, ruin food stashes meant to last till spring, and wreck homes that were already one storm away from being a pile of sticks like playing Jenga with your life savings. But the blocks are cows, and the wind's a jerk. Winter travel was a death wish, isolating villages for months and killing trade chat. And hey, can you help us out vibes, like being stuck in a medieval Zoom, meeting with no signal. You had to be 100% self-sufficient because waiting for the neighbors to save you was as smart as waiting for the sun to show up. Spoiler, it didn't. Life in medieval Scotland was a non-stop cycle of freak out to prep for winter, survive winter without losing all your toes, and rebuild in the tiny summer window before it starts again like a medieval hamster wheel with extra frostbite. This left zero time for anything beyond "don't die today," making long-term plans as rare as a warm January, like "let's dream big" about not starving next month. But somehow, these Scots turned into survival ninjas, figuring out how to preserve food through brutal winters, crafting clothes and shelters that laughed at the cold, and building community support systems that kept them going when life got extra mean. Like a medieval, we're all in this together montage, but with more shivering. This harsh climate didn't just test them, it forged the Scottish spirit into something tougher than a Highland rock, creating folks who were stubborn, scrappy, and ready to take on anything. Surviving those winters built a grit that had come in handy for the political and military messes ahead. Like, if you can survive a Scottish winter, you can survive anything. Even an English tax collector with a bad attitude. While the Scots were busy wrestling with a climate that seemed to have a personal vendetta against humanity, they also had to deal with a legal system that looked like it was designed by someone who thought justice should be as chaotic and scary as a Highland blizzard. Medieval Scottish law was a wild mashup of ancient Celtic rules, Norman legal flair, and the random whims of whoever was calling the shots like a medieval smoothie blender, tossing in tradition and foreign spice and a dash of, because I said so, leaving outcomes as predictable as a sheep's mood on shearing day. Overseeing this legal circus was Judge Morag MacBride, a guy whose idea of justice made modern tough on crime folks look like they were handing out hugs. Murdoch landed his gig through a mix of family connections, loyalty to the right people, and a knack for snap decisions that didn't let pesky things like evidence fairness, or what if they're innocent, slow him down, like a medieval Judge Judy, but with more executions and less sass. His courtroom was built to scare the kilts off anyone who walked in, decked out with torture tools on display, gruesome execution murals, and a vibe that screamed, "This isn't a trial. It's a medieval horror show. Grab your popcorn." Murdoch himself looked like he'd personally sent more folks to the afterlife than most people had invited to their wedding. His black robes were jazzed up with symbols of doom to remind everyone of the fun fates awaiting them. His voice boomed with the kind of authority that made you want to confess to stealing a sheep you'd never even met, and his whole attitude screamed mercy. Never heard of her like a medieval Darth Vader, but with a gavel instead of a lightsaber. Backing him up was Dougal Macbeth, whose title of executioner didn't quite cover his full resume, torture pro-fear factor specialist, and what we'd call a medieval HR guy who handled permanent layoffs. Dougal inherited the family business from his dad, who'd learned from his dad like a twisted dynasty of pain that went back generations, making death their bread and butter. His workshop was a medieval DIY nightmare packed with axes, swords, ropes, and custom gadgets designed to make dying as awful as possible, like a hardware store for the Grim Reaper, with every tool fine-tuned for maximum ouch and public spectacle. Dougal believed executions should be a learning moment for the crowd, teaching them crime doesn't pay by watching their neighbors exit in the most gruesome ways possible, like a medieval PSA with extra screams. He took pride in making each execution a blockbuster event, educational, memorable, and gross enough to make even the toughest Highlander think twice about nicking a loaf of bread like forget stealing. I'll just starve quietly, thanks. The legal system Murdoch and Dougal ran worked on the vibe that most folks were probably guilty of something, even if it wasn't the crime they were nabbed for, like, "You look shady, so let's punish you anyway." The goal wasn't to figure out if you did it, but to pick the right punishment, like a medieval game show where the prize was always pick your doom. This made trials super quick, skipping boring stuff, like investigations or evidence, and jumping straight to the let's make an example out of you finale. One of the wildest cases to hit Murdoch's court was Ishbel MacCormack's A Woman whose biggest crime seemed to be living alone and knowing her herbs, which in medieval Scotland was basically screaming, "I'm a witch, come get me." Ishbel had spent years playing Highland doctor using old-school remedies to help her village, but that know-how made her a target when things went south, like being blamed for a storm because you once said, "looks like rain." Trouble started when a fever swept through the village kids and her herbal fixes couldn't save them. In medieval logic, that wasn't sometimes medicine fails. It was, you must have cursed them, you witch-grieving parents needing someone to blame. Pointed at Ishbel faster than you can say light the bonfire, because it was easier to call her a witch than admit kids just died sometimes back then. Ishbel's trial was a medieval legal masterpiece, with evidence like neighbors swearing they saw her picking herbs at weird o'clock, chatting with her cat like it was her demon therapist, and skipping church more than a good Christian should. Like she missed Sunday Mass and talks to her cat burn her. Her living alone, knowing too much about healing and muttering while mixing herbs, was treated like a neon sign flashing, "I heart Satan," as if muttering wasn't just her grumbling about her bad day. Judge McMillan handled Ishbel's case with his usual justice. He'd already decided she was guilty before the trial even started, and was just debating whether to torch her right away or torture her first, to snitch on other witches like a medieval loyalty test with extra fire. The interrogation tactics used to get Ishbel to spill the beans were based on the rock-solid medieval logic that innocent folks could handle any amount of pain like champs, while the guilty would crack under pressure like a medieval tough guy contest where losing meant confessing. This genius method guaranteed confessions while doubling as a twisted kind of court entertainment for officials who got their kicks watching pain served up with a side of justice. Ishbel's ordeal was a medieval torture buffet. Sleep deprivation that left her more zombie than human physical pain, cranked to maximum ouch without killing her outright, and mind games featuring Vivid. Here's what happens to witches. Horror stories like a medieval infomercial, but for eternal damnation. The mix of agony and terror finally got her to confess, to chatting with demons, hexing cows, and using magic to kill the kids she'd actually tried to save, like admitting you caused a storm because you sneezed too hard. Her execution was turned into a community learning moment, part PSA, part medieval blockbuster, showing the dangers of witchy stuff while giving villagers a rare day out. Dougal MacBeath was the event planner, building a proper stake, stocking up on firewood, and making sure the flames would take their sweet time so Ishbel could repent before checking out like a slow-cooked BBQ with extra repentance sauce. The legal system also handled normal crimes with slightly less flair than witch hunts, but still with the creativity of a medieval reality show. Angus McCrory, a merchant accused of shady deals, landed in Judge McMillan's court after customers griped that his goods were garbage cloth that fell apart faster than a cheap kilt grain, more chaff than grain, and other scams that'd make a modern con artist blush. Today, that'd be a civil lawsuit, but in medieval Scotland it was a crime worthy of a punishment that'd scare other merchants straight, like a "don't mess with customers" warning with extra pain. The evidence against Angus was a parade of ticked-off buyers who said his cloth was trash. His grain was mostly filler, and his deals screamed profit over honesty, like buying a luxury plaid and getting a moth-eaten rag. In modern law, that's a contract issue, but medieval Scotland called it theft, deserving a punishment that'd make other merchants think twice, like a medieval "don't scam" or your toast memo. Angus's trial featured the legal gem known as trial by ordeal, based on the holy idea that God would save the innocent and let the guilty suffer like a divine game of hot potato where the potato's on fire. This method let God decide sparing humans the hassle of actually investigating, like outsourcing justice to the heavens with a side of good luck, pal. Angus's ordeal was to carry a sizzling hot iron a set distance, while court folks watched his hands melt to decide his fate. If they healed nicely, God was on his side. If they turned into a crispy mess, God had spoken guilty like a medieval lie detector test, but with more burns. Dougal MacBeath ran the show using his hurt but don't kill expertise to heat the iron just right time Angus's hot potato walk for clear results and judge the burns based on years of "yep, that looks guilty" experience like a medieval chef who specialized in cooking hands instead of haggis. Angus's burns were predictably nasty, proving his guilt, so he got publicly shamed, slapped with fines that left him broke, and a physical punishment to scare other merchants straight, like a medieval "don't scam" billboard with Angus as the poster boy. This legal system loved punishments that fit the crime with a twisted sense of humor, like a medieval "you did this, so we do that" game. Thieves might lose a hand to stop future sticky fingers, while rumor spreaders could say bye to their tongues to shut them up for good. Like a medieval problem-solve sticker, but with more blood. These punishments were public to teach the crowd showing the law was on the case, giving folks a grim kind of entertainment. Because Netflix wasn't a thing, and making sure everyone remembered what happened to rule breakers, like a medieval viral video, but with more screaming. Whether this system actually stopped crime is up for debate, but it definitely nailed the scare. Everyone silly part. People lived knowing any oops could land them in a punishment worse than death, creating a vibe where follow the rules, or else was the golden rule, like living in a medieval HOA, where breaking the rules meant a one-way ticket to Ouchtown. And so we wrap up our wild ride through the rugged, frost-bitten lands of medieval Scotland, a place where survival was a high-stakes art project, suffering was the daily special. And making it to old age was such a flex they'd have thrown a party if they weren't too busy shivering and starving. We've trekked alongside these tough as nails. Folks gawked at their battles against odds so steep they'd make a modern motivational poster blush, and cheered their stubborn, we're not quitting attitude, even when giving up looked like the sanest option, like staying in a sinking ship because you're too Scottish to admit defeat. Looking back over the centuries we've roamed, it's clear medieval Scotland was nature's ultimate. Let's see what you've got. Challenge a gauntlet of misery designed to test how much humans could take before packing their kilts and moving somewhere sunny. The Scots being the hard-headed champs, they were answered with a giant hold my ale, and refused to budge even when survival odds were slimmer than a Highland cow in a famine. And maybe France isn't so bad started sounding tempting. The clan system, for all its bloodshed that made family reunions look like tea parties, built loyalty thicker than a castle wall, keeping folks afloat through disasters that'd shatter softer communities, like a medieval buddy system with extra swords. When Clan MacDougall and Clan Cameron weren't trying to turn each other into pincushions, they showed a family-first vibe so fierce it kept their culture kicking through centuries of chaos. Like, we might stab each other, but we'll die for each other too. Peasant life, where a good day meant everyone was still breathing and the cows weren't stolen, forged a grit that'd make modern gym bros cry into their protein shakes. Folks like Morag MacBride and Gregor MacMoern lived a grind so brutal it'd exhaust an Iron Man champ, yet they still found time for a laugh and a cuddle. Like, sure, we're starving, but let's dance by the fire anyway. The Catholic Church, with its pay-up-or-burn rules and punishments so wild they'd make a modern activist faint, was also the only game in town for school doctor visits and welfare, like a medieval one-stop shop with a side of guilt trips. Sister Fiona Mackenzie proved faith could spark real kindness, while the church's darker side reminded everyone that power could be scarier than a clan raid, like a holy tax collector with a knack for torture. The Wars of Independence, led by legends like Sir Malcolm McIntyre and later Robert McAlpin, aka Robert the Bruce, showed that even when the enemy had more troops, better gear. And all the gold, a mix of sneaky smarts, home field advantage, and we're not going down, grit could win the day like David Verse's Goliath, but with more kilts and mud. Scotland snagging independence against all odds proves that sheer stubbornness, plus knowing every sneaky Highland pass can beat even the fanciest army, like you brought longbows. Cute, we brought desperation. The Black Death, medieval Scotland's version of an apocalypse party, wiped out a third of the population, and left survivors wondering if God had ghosted them entirely, like, did we miss a memo from upstairs? But it also showed how fragile life was, and how epic humans can be at rebuilding like a medieval phoenix rising from the ashes, but with more porridge and fewer feathers. Recovery took teamwork only possible in a place where everyone knew we're all in this mess together, like a medieval group hug, but with extra germs. The Highland-Lowland culture clash, while it stirred up drama that made unity feel like herding cats, also proved diversity can be a superpower when you mix and match survival hacks. Chieftain Torquil McNeil's, we've always done it this way, Highland vibes, and Lord Kenneth Stewart's, let's try some fancy European stuff. Adaptability were two sides of the same survival coin. Like, you bring the old school grit, I'll bring the new school tricks and we'll both not die Scotland's weather, which seemed cooked up by a deity with a grudge against cozy-shaped folks tougher than a Highland rock. Mary McRae, Grigor MacMahern, and Coinage McIver showed that knowing nature's every mood swing and prepping like doomsday preppers could keep you alive in conditions that screamed humans not welcome, like winning a staring contest with a blizzard and saying, "Is that all you've got?" The justice system run by charmers like Judge Murdoch Macmillan and Dougal Macbeath was so brutal it made modern tough on crime look like a timeout. It was a system where order came from fear, because anything softer was a luxury, like we can't afford fairness when we're all one bad harvest. From chaos, Ishbel MacCormack and Angus MacRory's trials showed how justice back then was less about truth and more about, let's make an example, like a medieval reality show where the loser gets torched. Through all this chaos, the Scots built a national vibe that'd stick around for centuries. You can't tell us what to do, streak that made them a nightmare to conquer a dark humor that laughed in misery's face, and a stubbornness that let them outlast disasters that'd wipe out whole civilizations elsewhere, like plague. English invasion, winter, bring it on. That medieval grit still shines in modern Scots who mix warm, come in for a dram vibes with a steel core that kicks in when life gets tough, like we survived the 14th century so your Wi-Fi outage doesn't scare us. Today's Scotland, with its cozy homes, stocked fridges, top-notch healthcare, and laws that don't involve burning folks for fun, is a dream compared to medieval times. Living past 30 kids growing up and winter being a grab, a code annoyance instead of a death sentence would have blown a medieval Scot's mind. Like you mean, I don't have to fight a blizzard for my porridge. But this cushy life was built on the blood sweat and frozen tears of Scots, who faced insane odds with a "we're not done yet" attitude, like medieval architects of grit who built a nation. One stubborn step at a time, the castles and abbeys dotting Scotland today are high fives to folks who made beautiful things while dodging death daily. Like, sure, we might starve, but let's build a pretty church first. These medieval tales remind us humans are tougher than we think, and communities forged in hardship can do the impossible. Like, you survived a Highland winter, you can survive anything. Scotland's survival as a unique nation. Despite centuries of, "you've got to be kidding me," challenges proves the human spirit. When it's got a cause, and a kilt can take on the world, and when, like a medieval underdog story with the best soundtrack ever, bagpipes, stubbornness, and a whole lot of heart. As you snuggle into your cozy safe bed tonight, basically living the medieval Scots' wildest, I wish dream, maybe spare a thought for those tough old ancestors who woke up each day knowing survival was a coin toss, and comfort was rarer than a sunny Highland afternoon. Their daily grind wins losses and sheer, we're still here. Guts laid the groundwork for our cushy modern world, like medieval DIYers building a future with nothing but grit and a few sheep. Sleep tight, knowing that whatever drama tomorrow throws at you, it's peanuts compared to what those folks handled with sass. A dark chuckle and the kind of, "we're not done yet." Stubbornness that laughed in defeat's face like, "Oh, you think we'll quit? Watch this sweet dreams and take comfort." Your worst headache isn't a clan raid, a plague party, or Judge Murdoch Macmillan's. Let's get creative justice like a medieval pop quiz where failing meant a one-way ticket to Ouchtown. The Scotland that clawed its way out of those brutal centuries was cooked in a pot of pure hardship, seasoned with suffering, and glued together by folks who knew standing together was the only way to survive whatever life threw at them, like a medieval team-building exercise with extra swords and less trust falls. It's a legacy worth toasting, with a dram cheering, with a kilt twirl, and carrying into whatever future's waiting like. We survived the Middle Ages, so we've got this